So the long story short is that for most of those years, the ideas about British and U.S. folklore kind of took a back seat to the study of folklore, more generally speaking. And from this example here, you can see that there is an enormous amounts of research on the German folklore that is peppered with some bits of American and British folklore on this question. So you have examples by Richard Dawson, the articles that I quoted in the last slides, and there's also the curing of blindness in folk tales, but everything else is written in German. And in fact, the study of folklore, generally speaking, was mostly about these foreign kind of legends, those myths from the old land, and very little of it was focused on what was happening out of those places. Again, because there's this weird classifications of indigenous folks and essentially non-European folks as being backward or being on a different plane of humanity, if you will. By the 1960s, there's a kind of a new crop of folklore research, mostly because the American experience turns out that you have all kinds of varieties of folklore that exist there and legends that seem to have traveled around the slave trade, that have traveled around the United States and Canada through indigenous trade as well. And part of that means that there's a very big discovery or rediscovery of the kinds of things that could exist in folklore and in legends. That being said, the broader understanding of the legends really has this identity crisis between the how to classify the stories of one group of people and the other. This address to the Journal of American Folklore points out that we should be guilty of overweening self-interest, though if we fail to acknowledge the very basic contribution of these societies in their own right, and if we fail to avail ourselves of the important collateral work going on the Modern Language Association of America and related language societies, the American Anthropological Association and its affiliated group, the American Dialect Society, the Medieval Academy of America, the Society of Ethnomusicology, the American Name Society, the American Studies Association, the American Historical Association, and its numerous state and regional affiliates, and organizations dedicated to the folk arts and the folklore of material culture. So the kind of the broader appeal of stories to people who don't just look at folklore, but they look at history, look at language, look at all kinds of cultural approaches means that the stories that exist in our legends become part of a much broader field of studies. And certainly, when the scientific world as a whole became a lot more focused on, well, I guess scientific studies, you could say, on finding out kind of the solid proof of what existed in previous civilization, the study of oral traditions such as legends and folklore really became a different field altogether because you had to figure out the exact meaning of words for which you may not have the correct context or you have the full historical account. And as far as science was concerned, in the later, more positivist approach to science, it was just not acceptable to have kind of this vagueness or this lack of precision in a way. And the argument turned into really is if it was possible to be scientific when it comes to folklore because of this lack of detail, because of this lack of accuracy. There was generally speaking a big distrust of the study of folklore. And this is pointed out here in the article by Linda Degg in looking at Irish folklore, especially. So kind of on the margins of the European tales. In his recent brief article, our colleague Bill Nicolaisen expressed his chagrin over the irreconcilable differences of opinion concerning major aspects of the legend that can have destructive consequences, which produce severe self-doubt, leading to reluctance, debilitating introspection, or complete inertia. Personally, I feel that differences of opinions, even if they seem irreconcilable, are the yeast of the scholarly process. In other words, if we all agree and there is nothing to take issue with, there is no point in continuing research. I am delighted that the legend keeps us thinking and coming up with a number of confrontational ideas to continue intellectual exchange. And yes, of course, in that case, the fact that there is something to talk about and no final point to any conversation of folklore also means that those legends are an endless source of discussion, an endless source of information, and even finding new versions, longer versions, shorter versions, really adds on top of the narratives and really just creates a much longer, a much bigger story that we can see much clearer of. And in the middle of the 60s, alongside the conversations about urban legends and all that, there is just a larger move into recognizing the role that stories play in people. Mostly because it seems like wherever you go, however long people have been talking about these things, there have been stories being circulated over the years that have more or less anchoring in reality, more or less truth to them. And this has never stopped, not in the ancient world, not in the quote unquote civilized world. And so it seems like there should be some kind of elemental, again, primordial value to the story. Some people even propose that the humans should be classified as they are today as a new kind of human, the human that tells stories, or man, the storyteller. Something quite different is happening when we hear this sort of complicated conversation among crows. The first says, "There's a horse behind this mountain." The second responds, "Is there any meat on it?" A third maintains, "Only skin and bones." This charming etiological tale on the origin of Crow language, known in Germany as well as other European folk, is an invention of man the storyteller who substitutes his own emotional and mental makeup for that of the animals. And with this example, we have now arrived at man the storyteller, Homo narrans. Now, of course, Homo narrans is kind of a theoretical term. This is not supposed to be a biological replacement, but this is the same time when we have these conversations of Homo sapiens and Gigantopithecus, as we have mentioned him a couple of weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago, and trying to figure out the place of humans in a much broader tree, and if we place our modern existence as Homo narrans, the same way that other people propose Homo sapiens, or there's a psychological man, an ecclesiastical man, there's all kinds of economic man, Homo economicus. There's all kinds of these. Kind of defining features that have been associated with our modern existence. And the idea really took hold because people really pointed out to the value of the story as a very central element of knowledge, that you can just put a lot of connections between the world that you know and the world that you don't know into a story and carry that story along much more efficiently than you carry books or even, the full uh, scientific telling of a story. And so, in this context here, is a different man as a storyteller. Many different root metaphors have been put forth to represent the essential nature of human being: Homo faber, Homo economicus, Homo politicus, Homo sociologicus, psychological man, ecclesiastical man, Homo sapiens, and of course, rational man. I propose that Homo narrans be added to the list. Perhaps appropriately, two different people have come up with that same concept of the Homo narrans, the men that tell stories, around the same time to refer to the same process. Like, again, this aspect of the new import of folklore in the much larger story. And as we have mentioned previously, of course, in this class, none of that is obviously new because the early stories of people have been very much part of trying to understand how we make sense of them. This is from Edward Fraser that we have mentioned several times already. And of course, Edward Fraser tells us that this aspect of the story as a connection of various elements has to do mostly with time. Because when you are telling a story, you have the possibility to play along with time, to compress time, to stretch it if necessary, to really move with the most terrible part of our lives, which is the fact that time just never stops and keeps on going. Is that however much we would like for our stories to have a very clear beginning and an end, it's not really what happens. And of course, the myth gives us an idea of a beginning. Sometimes it gives us an idea of an end, whether you're talking about the apocalypse or whatever. But generally speaking, it is a way for us to make sense of something that is otherwise very hard to make sense out of. Fraser tells us that time is a matter of measurement, of course, when we compare these stories of the burning of Semiramis and Dido and other in with this historical case of the burning of the Oriental monarchs, we may perhaps conclude that there was a time when queens as well as kings were expected under certain circumstances, perhaps on the death of their consort, to perish in the fire. The conclusion can hardly be deemed extravagant when we remember that the practice of burning widows to death survived in India under English rule down to a time within living memory. At Jerusalem itself, a reminiscence of the practice of burning kings, alive or dead, appears to have lingered as late as the time of Isaiah, who says, "For Tophet is prepared of old, yea, for the king it is made ready, he has made it deep and large, the pile thereof is fire and much of wood, and the breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, doth kindle it." So if we measure time in years and you live for a certain time, you have these weeks and these months that you can write on the calendar year, you have a much easier way to make sense of your day, a much easier way to make sense of your life, a much easier sense to way to make life of your memory. And sometimes it can be very long. It could be a century, it could be a millennium, it could be billions of years, it could be a geological age for all we care. These are ways that we use to make sense out of our past and, of course, to a certain extent, to our future, however long we have left on Earth. So the way that we make sense of the very deep um, stretches of our lives has to do with this classification of time. If we can make sense of the classification of times in terms of the things that used to be and the things that are now, making sense of those connections. And so Fraser in The Golden Bow really shows how the mythological story has a pretty straightforward function that is repeated over spans of time and place. Then you can make sense of exactly what is changing underneath our feet and what is not. You could also make sense of it psychologically. Why are we doing those things? Why are we taking care of time? And why are we repeating those things that existed before us? This is a way, again, for us to connect to things that we do not make sense out of or that we cannot make sense out of very easily. So the aspect of making sense of the world is pretty important, and it is in fact one of the readings that we are making today or this week from Bruce Gapfer, who points out to the fact that the various stories and legends that exist in India are really, however extensive they might be, just a matter of putting things into a certain order, a chronological order, as well as a logical order to make sense out of the vast history and the vast past of the peoples of India. And as he points out in the article, and you can read the whole thing on perusal, my highly abbreviated recounting of these events as they are recorded in the Mahavamsa displays a series of inversions which in their reversal lead to the reestablishment of order. Their reversal is also a transformation. Thus, Dutu was outside the state or at its margins, and its representative without power comes inside the state and is reinstated as the embodiment of its possibilities. He moves from being demonic to being beneficent, incorporating within himself their dynamic, ordering complementarity. The stage is set for Dutugemunu, having traversed the range of the hierarchical order he embodies to achieve a higher encompassment. And you are once again connecting with the ideas of crossing thresholds or crossing certain boundaries and making sense of those boundaries, which could be time boundaries for all we know, from the past to the future, from how we used to be to how we are now. And this can be made sense out of using legends, using myths. And mostly it allows us to give that sense of how far we've gone or maybe how little we've gone, depending on what the story is telling us. And Eliade points out that really the main principle that exists behind these stories is to give us a sense of perspective, that we can put things onto a historical timeline to show us exactly how things are connecting or disconnecting. We believe we are justified in seeing in them, rather than a resistance to history, a revolt against historical time, an attempt to restore this historical time, freighted as it is with human experience, to a place in the time that is cosmic, cyclical, and infinite. In any case, it is worth noting that the work of two of the most significant writers of our day, T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, is saturated with nostalgia for the myth of eternal repetition and, in the last analysis, for the abolition of time. There is also reason to foresee that as the terror of history grows worse, as existence becomes more and more precarious because of history, the positions of historicism will increasingly lose in prestige. So, of course, this is pretty interesting to see in context of Eliade. Eliade, who ended up being a Nazi collaborator, by the way. The idea that you can use those larger mythical stories to make sense out of your dreadful existence, or as he calls it, the terror of history, is somewhat of an interesting concept because we are, after all, dealing with some level of anxiety about what we know and what we don't know, about the past, the present, and the future. So using this time that is more or less fantastical or mythical, cosmic, cyclical, and infinite allows us to put us into a place where we are in fact not living in the moment. We are kind of alleviated of that burden of anxiety. And the great part about this in that in mythical time, anything can happen. The bets are off, essentially. Again, we are knocking on that speculation that happened in the contest of ghosts, is that there is in the legend a time where all things could have been possible. And that means that there might be another time where later things will be possible again. You could put that in terms of the difference between Marvel and DC. And Marvel, everything is fantastical and anything can happen. And you don't have to explain much all of the inconsistencies because this is a fantastic time, as opposed to DC superheroes that live in a time that is kind of like our own and whose existence is much more tied to our own anxieties. So if we see ourselves as living in this time that is fantastical, where anything can happen, or if we see ourselves in this time where everything is concrete and only a certain things can happen, it allows us to make sense of what could happen next, whether it's good or bad. Maybe good wins in the end, as it always does, or maybe bad wins in the end, but then something good can come out of it. This is a way to make sense out of our past, our present, but maybe our some version of destiny, I guess.